This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
Hello and welcome to Bookmark This, a Straits Times podcast in which we talk about books and their headlines and recommend to you new reads. I'm Olivia Ho and I am joined today by my co-host, Toh Wen Li.
Hello.
Today we have a special year-end episode for you. Last Sunday, we published a list of the 50 greatest works of SingLit, written or translated into English. And it was quite a complicated undertaking because so I had to get a lot of literary experts like booksellers, critics, academics, librarians, editors, and more. And we put together this list of works from across the Singapore literary canon. And today we have one of those people here on the podcast with us as a special guest. So this is our senior cultural correspondent, Ong Sor Fern, who was present when many of these books were published, and she wrote some of their very first reviews. So welcome to Bookmark This.
Hi, thanks for inviting me.
So obviously a list like this was always going to be pretty contentious. A lot of people will be like, why is this on the list? Why is that not on the list? So I'm going to give some context about how we put it together. So we define SingLit for this exercise as books written by Singaporean or Singapore-based writers and or published in Singapore. We included genres like fiction, creative nonfiction, poetry, graphic novels, but we did not include academic or technical nonfiction or theatre scripts or screenplays because that's like that will open a whole other can of worms. Panelists each submitted a list of their top 10 SingLit books, which were compiled by me into a master list. They were not allowed to nominate their own works or works that they were involved in publishing or editing. Then they each voted for 50 works from the master list. Again, their own works or works that they were involved in were automatically counted in their tally. And then I compiled the votes and adjudicated any ties for the final list, for which fortunately there weren't that many ties. It was actually quite interesting. Because this was a group effort, I think none of us really knew how it was going to turn out until a few days ago. So I think even for me and the others, there were a few surprises. So any thoughts on the final list of 50?
Well, 50 titles is a lot. It obviously covers a lot of ground. And I think, it will hopefully be a useful starting point for readers who want to get to know the Singapore canon, so to speak, a bit better. I was very glad to see fresher titles like Shabiji Rao's Pulp, Marilyn Tan's poetry collection Gaze Bag, and Jeremy Tiang's State of Emergency make the list. Also, of course, Sonny Liu's graphic novel The Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chai, which this list would not be complete without. Very pleased to see several works in translation, which I think many English readers might not be too familiar with. So that would be a good introduction to those titles.
Sorfern, what about you?
Okay, I have to say that I hate doing lists because the whole time that I was doing it, all I could think about was the shortcomings. What are we leaving out? Is it fair to compare genres? And what are people going to say? But I have to say that the final list is actually very fun to read. There's such a diversity of voices and genres. And I think it, like what Wen Li said, is a good starting point for us to think about to pause, take a breath, assess and appreciate, because there's quite a staggering array of creation in this list that I don't think we've actually looked at in one place before.
Well, let's go through the list chronologically. It starts maybe a bit unexpected for some people, as early as the 19th century with the Hikayat Abdullah, or the Autobiography of Munshi Abdullah, which was published in 1849 and translated into English, most notably by A.H. Hill in 1949. So Abdullah Abdul Qadir was better known as Munshi Abdullah. He was Sir Stamford Raffles' copyist and later his secretary and translator in Singapore. So this is quite an interesting choice to kick things off with, because this is the one work on the list that predates the notion of independent Singapore by quite a lot. And this was your nomination, Sorfern, so why did you choose it?
Okay, when I first read it, I was completely blown away because this book is a classic example of great creative nonfiction. It is vivid, it is firsthand, and when you read it, you get this immediate voice in your head, and this person, Munshi Abdullah, suddenly bursts into life in front of you. And all the dry history books that deal with Singapore's colonial history never give voice to the so-called natives, but here is an articulate, sharp-witted, observant man who saw it all happen and wrote it down. And it is really, really quite a funny read in some places because you suddenly realize that, goodness, this so-called natives that's always been dismissed in colonial narratives as like uh on the background, never acknowledged, and you suddenly realize this man can be quite bitchy. He's very observant, and he's obviously very, very sharp, and he moves between worlds, and he's got sort of like, and he is an active participant in events as well, given his role in the colonizers' place here. Yeah.
I think
Mm.
people give it some flack because of he's clearly very fond of Raffles, and so they view him as looking at things through this colonized lens.
But I think that if you read it right, that is the other reason why I find it very interesting, because I think he's aware that his living depends on the colonizers, but there are gaps in the writing that are very interesting, and I'm quite sure he's aware of the gaps in the writing. The things that he chooses to leave out is as interesting as the stuff that he chooses to put in. So you see this very active intelligence at work here, very canny, very political mind. And that's why when I read it, I was like, wow, why isn't this like compulsory reading in schools? Because that is really the empire writing back in the first and earliest form.
Moving on to the 1970s. Now, the other books that people were quite unanimous about putting on the list include these post-independence classics that we always hear about. So one of them is If We Dream Too Long by Gopal Singh. It's said to be the first post-independence Singaporean novel in English. And then there are two Catherine Lim's short story collections that are also very classic. One is Little Ironies, and the other is Or Else the Lightning God and Other Stories. So If We Dream Too Long, it was not very well reviewed upon its publication. The reception was quite unenthusiastic, but it's since become regarded as this really landmark work. It's I think as often you called it the original emo kid writing. So he's this disaffected young clerk who he's filled with ennui, struggling with his career, his love life, his sense of identity in this increasingly urbanized, increasingly materialistic Singapore of the 1960s. Then we have the Catherine Lims. I think people, well, I at least from young, I associated with her with these like long, pulpy period drama books like The Bondmaid, the Teardrop Story Woman, but actually, when you read a short story, she's such a sharp writer, and when she's being very succinct and writing in small doses, and a lot of the stories, even though they were written in the 1970s, they're very relatable today. There's very heavy topics like domestic abuse, like the student who commits suicide over her grades in Little Ironies. And it's worth noting that Or Else the Lightning God was the first Singapore text to be studied by O-level students worldwide from 1989 to 1990. That was quite a milestone for Singapore literature back then. And if you're talking about English poetry in Singapore, there is the big three. So that's Edwin Thumboo, Arthur Yap, Lee Soo Ping. And again, no question that they will be on the list. And the problem was because of the way that I designed the exercise, people kept voting for different collections. I think that everybody involved voted for at least one Arthur Yap collection, but they all voted for different ones. So like I think Man, Snake, Apple down the line, and all of these collections are now out of print. So in the end, it seemed best to go with the greatest hits collections, which thankfully all three of them have. That would be the best of Edwin Thumboo, the collected poems of Arthur Yap, and Soul's Festival, which Lee Soo Ping's collected poems from 1980 to 1997. Edwin Thumboo, often dubbed the unofficial poet laureate of Singapore. He set the foundations basically for the nation's post-colonial poetry scene. He had seminal volumes like Gods Can Die, Ulysses by the Merlion, the title poem of which spawned countless Malayan poems and is practically its own genre. Arthur Yap, one of the most important poets in Singapore history, is groundbreaking in the way that he treated everyday life and his grasp of language, the way that evolved, especially his use of colloquial Singlish in poems like Two Mothers in an HDB Playground or The Correctness of Flavor. And finally, Li Ping, she's often referred to as Singapore's preeminent female poet. And she's major poems, major volumes, Prospect of a Drowning, Against the Next Wave, and Brink of an Amen. And also Lambada by Galilee and Other Surprises, which is one of her slightly later works. I think that is your favorite, Sorfern.
Yes, that is. Because I think also that was my introduction to her work. Because I think that when I was a younger reader, I never really paid much attention to like the serious poets from the older first generation poets. But when I became an books reporter, the first like serious poet I had to interview was Li Ping, and I always known her as my teacher in school because she taught me Shakespeare. And, reading her was such a revelation because I think by then I was more adult. I could appreciate her technical accomplishments as well as how contemporary and fresh those things were because that was a new collection at that point in time. And I felt that I could relate to her much more than, say, Professor Edwin Thumboo and his form of like post-colonial nation building writing, which I quite frankly found a little bit staid.
Some maybe less expected works in this list: The Teenage Textbook by Adrian Tan. But I'm pleased that it made it because it is an important bestseller in local history. One generation of teenagers probably all remembers it very well. And a new generation may, because there's now a MediaCorp TV series about it. And Transcreations in 1988 by Ilangvan, who is better known as a playwright. So this is a quite hard to find bilingual collection of poetry in Tamil and English. And it's very short, it's very stinging. It's got these excoriating lines like, come on, discount the eye droppings, wipe off the lymphatic woes from your bosom. That's from Path Verse for a Poet. So very interesting and intriguing to see all these included. Moving on to the 1990s, we're getting into a lot of fiction. We've got landmark stuff like Fascist Rock by Claire Thumb, which was the angsty teenagers who probably didn't like teenage textbook. I don't know. Anyway, it's full of these rebellious characters, the punk youths of Singapore. Candle or the Sun by Gopal Baratham. That was a controversial novel about this budding author who is forced to choose between literary success and the woman he loves. She's part of this Christian sect that has a political agenda. So this book was so hot, it could not be published in Singapore. It had to get published in London. Yeah, so I think it's quite interesting to see what was controversial back then and controversial now. And it seems that controversy just sort of runs like a seam through our literary publishing history. Books like these big historical books like Shrimp People by Rex Shelley, what we call the great Singapore Eurasian novel. Fistful of Colours by Susan Christine Lim. This book won the inaugural Singapore Literature Prize, again, very major. Abraham's Promise by Philip Jeyaretnam, another bestseller, chart topper like Adrian Tan. And Gone Case by Dave Chua, which I think sort of heralds the rise of the HDB novel. So, any thoughts on this moment in fiction history?
I think this was like when there were like multiple generations writing at the same time and getting published. And I thought it was really interesting because, they all addressed like very, very Singaporean issues, which I think was great. And I love the fact that they were on the bestsellers list because it showed that there was a hunger for local stories told well and that Singapore authors could sell to a local audience. I mean, I don't think that they sold in the numbers that they do now, but I think they were the start of like the serious fiction being taken seriously and doing well commercially enough that publishers would take a risk, publish an unpublished author to look at Singaporean authors as a possible source of commercial success. And I think in book publishing, that's very important to growing the scene.
Yeah, I think we're looking at figures like 50,000 for the teenage textbook, which I think back then it was a big deal. Now it would be a big deal, 50,000.
Yes.
So when I started this project, I wanted it to be multilingual. That did not work out, partly because, again, I think the results just skewed overwhelmingly towards English writing. I think people are not comfortable judging across language barriers. And so I came to the conclusion that this could not claim to be representative of the mother tongue literatures. So we had to give up on that part of the project and change the parameters. But I'm glad, though, that people could nominate works in translation by the likes of Muhammad Latif Muhammad and Ying Pei An, who passed away earlier this year. May he rest in peace. A lot of these novels are about Singapore's political history or the region's political history, and they frame them through the perspective of an individual or a few individuals, like the artist group in Art Studio or the widower in The Widower, who is also a former political detainee. So the books that I'm talking about are Confrontation and The Widower by Muhammad Latif Muhammad, translated by Shafiq Salamat and Alfian Saad, respectively, and Unrest by Ying Pei An, which is translated by Jeremy Tiang. Then you can see a bit of that, how that influences Tiang's later work, which we'll come to later on in this podcast. And Art Studio, which is this huge tome that I think was recently made into a theatre adaptation, which was 3 hours long. Very ambitious book, very ambitious adaptation. It's very well loved. That was translated by Mr. Ng's wife, Goh Ming Chu, as well as the poet Lo Guan Liang. And we also have The Earnest Mass by Senior. And that's a series of short stories, very short stories from the 1980s to the 2000s, and they peel back the mask from the face of Singaporean stoicism. That was translated from Chinese by Howard Goldblatt and Sylvia Lee Chun Lee. Now, if you like what you're listening to, subscribe to our podcast series, Bookmark This, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Like us and give us a rating too. Back to our show and on to our next book. So now we arrive at the great poetry boom of the 2000s. Sorfern, you were very involved in the lit scene as a critic during this period. So could you describe what that was like for you?
I think it was a very dynamic scene, and I was actually very fortunate to be a part of it as well and what struck me was also that the young writers at that point in time, there was this very collegial atmosphere. The writers hung out together. They had they went to each other's homes for meals and barbecues, and they bounced ideas off each other. They were all shortlisted for the Singapore Literature Prize at that time, and they kind of sort of met because of that, because at that point in time, the Singapore Literature Prize would take in unpublished manuscripts. So they looked at it as a way of getting published. So they found themselves in the same room talking to each other. And they also found strength in numbers, because I think at that time, Alvin Pang was very instrumental in writing grant applications. So he got all of us grants to travel, and he organized book tours. So we started very small to Malaysia, and then it got more and more ambitious. They went to the Philippines, they went to Australia, they went to US, and Alvin would joke that it's kind of like a rock concert tour for the writers. So we all had a lot of fun, and I actually accompanied them on some of the tours. So I got to see firsthand how they interacted and how impressed the people overseas were, because at that point in time, the academic circles internationally didn't realize that there was this young, vibrant crowd of new young writers, and they were very different from the generation that came before, because they were post-independence, they had very confident voices, they were very cosmopolitan, and they believed in what they had to say, and they were very confident about saying what they said. So, when they went on tour, people were very impressed, because it was a very cosmopolitan and unexpected group of diverse voices that came from this tiny little city state out in the middle of nowhere, which they don't think of as a place that produces poets. Yeah. So it was really fun to document that part of Singapore's literary history.
Very special moment.
Mm.
So we mentioned earlier One Fierce Hour by Alfian Saad. That was would you say that was a game changer in local poetry, or his breakout
Mm.
debut?
I think that, he was published by Landmark Books. And there was like actually the thing that kickstarted it was actually Mr. Hong Ho Fang, who founded Ethos Book. And up until that point, Landmark, I think, had like cornered the market on literary publishing because it was like the first and small indie publisher that was like not a mainstream big publisher like Times Edition that bought and sold things like Catherine Lim and published like top bestsellers. And because Ethos Book published Alvin Pang and Aaron Lee, so there was like a little competition going on. So I wouldn't say that it was just Alfian's book that kickstarted or made a revolution in the poetry scene, but it was this kind of competition between the two indie publishers, Ethos and Landmark, that suddenly foregrounded a lot of then unheard poets. And it was very interesting because a lot of them came from an overseas education. So they didn't grow up in the scene here, so to speak. They weren't mentored by Edwin Tambu or Li Zuping or Arthur Yap because their tertiary education was in the US, in the UK, and they brought like a new wave of writing to the scene. Alfian is very, very local, but between all these diverse voices, it suddenly appeared like poetry was booming, you know, yeah. So it was really quite an unusual moment, I think. And we did talk about this because, poetry doesn't sell in Singapore. So I was very curious as a young books writer, and I asked them, why did you choose poetry? And they had very interesting responses to that because they said that, poetry doesn't take as much effort to write. It's short. If you want to write a novel, it's long, it's a marathon, whereas a poem is a sprint. And also, I think by that point in Singapore's literary history, poetry had been neglected because, as the list shows, before that in the 90s and the 80s, it was prose, it was short fiction, and nobody was writing or publishing poetry. And, art tends to be, the practitioners tend to find gaps that they think they can fill or they can exploit. And poetry at that point in time was a genre where there was this big gap to be plugged. Yeah.
Mm.
So they chose to use poetry as the way that they express themselves.
Mm.
So it was very, very interesting to document that trend.
I think one book that I was quite happy to see make the list was the anthology No Other City, edited by Aaron Lee and Alvin Pang. So I think I'm not sure back then how it was, but that seemed to me like a very turning point as an anthology goes. It's described as the first anthology to consider Singapore as a city state, an urban city state, and it's got more than 60 writers involved across generations, very famous people, very unfamous people who the editors had never even heard of, but who then went on to become quite famous. Like I think Ang Yisheng is one of these, and it was because when I was like a teenager and encountering Singapore poetry for the first time, this is the batch of writers that I first met, and so that anthology has like a really special place in my heart. Now we are in the 2010s. So here's where we get this, a lot of very strong fiction coming out again. This thing seems to come in waves. So we get a lot of novelists making it big abroad, especially female novelists. Not sure why that is. We have people like Meira Chan and Min Fong Ho, whose journeys is, I think her anthology was published earlier in 2008. But Meira Chan with A Different Sky, this big historical epic that was published abroad. And then later on, we have like Amanda Lee Ko, Bali Kaur Jaswal. Both of these are authors who have been published both locally and in foreign countries. And in Singapore, you have the Epigram Books Fiction Prize, and that starts to draw out a lot of quality fiction. So some of my favorite books are from this period, like Sugar Bread by Bali Kaur Jaswal, that story about this Punjabi Sikh family, and the buried traumas. It's very frank about the way it tackles like racism and sexism. It's I think it's an incredible read. Ministry of Moral Panic by Amanda Lee Coe, which is again another book that a lot of people quote when they're thinking of like the best of SingLit. The Inlet by Claire Tham, returning again from fascist rock. This one is a very interesting social political thriller, so to speak, about this hostess who's found dead, and then the investigation into her death uncovers a lot of fractures in Singapore society. And also we have The Goddess in the Living Room by Latha. That is a series of short stories translated from the Tamil, and she gives voice to a lot of Tamil women in Singapore across many different kinds, all walks of life. But if there is one book that has an outsized impact in the 2010s, that would be The Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chai by Sonny Liu. So first graphic novel to win the Singapore Literature Prize, 3 Eisner Awards, famously controversial because the National Arts Council withdrew its funding. There are people who feel that it is the best work of SingLit ever, and people who don't even think it should have been considered as literature because it is a comic book. So thoughts on this issue? Yes or no?
Yes, it's a graphic novel. One of the most powerful works of SingLit to have been published ever, I think.
And I think it's actually a monumental accomplishment. And I don't use that word lightly, okay? Because I think on top of being a masterpiece in narrative, it is also art, literally, because he draws everything. And quite frankly, I've been following Sunny since Malinki Robot days. And quite frankly, I never knew he had it in him to do such a complex, layered, thoughtful work. It is very ambitious, it is epic, and it pulls it off. He pulls it off beautifully.
Yeah, embarrassingly enough, I thought that Charlie Chang Hock Chai was a real person. While I was reading the book, I was like, oh, this. Well, he's got a really diverse range. This artist, and then I found out that it wasn't that Sunny Liu had made him up, and that was even more impressed. That was mind blowing for me.
Yes.
On the subject of books made famous by NAC funded controversies, we also have Jeremy Tiang's State of Emergency. And Wen Li, I think Jeremy Tiang is your favorite local author. Is that the case?
He's one of my favorite local authors. I mean, it's sometimes quite inexplicable why you gravitate towards one author versus another. But Tiang was one of the first local authors I read whose writing really spoke to me. Well, first of all, he's an excellent writer, but beyond that, I think he has that ability to capture some of the more unpleasant but relatable aspects of Singapore society without cloying it with excessive bitterness or sentimentalism. We see this in It Never Rains on National Day, which is his 2015 collection of short stories about people in and from Singapore, well, also in State of Emergency, his 2017 Singapore Literature Prize-winning novel, which kind of looks at the history of leftist movements and political tensions in Singapore and Malaysia. I feel that one of Tiang's greatest virtues as a writer is his clear-eyed restraint. When he writes, he manages to stay a step away from his subject matter, and somehow when you read his fiction, it doesn't feel too claustrophobic.
And I think earlier we mentioned we were surprised but happy to see Pulp by Shibigi Rao on the list. This is a very unusual book. It's, I think, comparable to the Sunny Liu book in how visually and conceptually stunning it is. It's perhaps not for the lay reader, but it is a genre-defining project that looks at destruction of books and libraries. I think any bibliophile should probably check this one out. It's interesting to note in this list how there's this sharp jump in science fiction and fantasy, which a decade ago would not have got a look in from the literary establishment. I think that people were not even considering science fiction or fantasy as legitimate literary genres. I think some of the major shifting points we observe are things like The Gatekeeper, like Nuralia Norisid, which won the 2016 Epigram Books Fiction Prize. And I think this can be said to be the work that bridges the much older tradition of Malay speculative fiction and the Nusantara with this more this English language fantasy tropes. And another work would be the Tenserit series by Neon Yang, which is represented on this list by the Black Tides of Heaven. Yang was one of the first Singaporean finalists for the Hugo and Nebula Awards, and this book earned a spot on Time Magazine's 100 Best Fantasy Books of All Time. And finally, Lion City by Ng Yisheng. This was I think it's the first science fiction and fantasy work to win the Singapore Literature Prize in English, if you don't consider Charlie Chan Hop Chai, which is a little speculative. Yeah, so that's interesting to see how that genre suddenly pops up towards the end of the last decade. And finally, we said we'd come back to how poetry has, the poetry scene has been evolving. So this is, I think, a lot of works towards the end of this list represent that new frontier. So we've got A Field Guide to Supermarkets in Singapore by Samuel Lee, who holds the record for the youngest winner of the Singapore Literature Prize at 26. And this is a very fun collection. It's semi-inspired by Philip Glass's Einstein at the Beach, particularly the section, I was in this prematurely air-conditioned supermarket, and I love that for it. Marilyn Tan's Gaze Back, the first winner of the Singapore Literature Prize for English Poetry, first woman to fully win the prize for poetry in any language. This is a arcane, unapologetic collection, talks about sexuality, menstruation, witchcraft, all these taboos. I think we did a podcast episode on it, Wen Li and I, with Yisheng's book. So Gaze Back and Lion City, which then won in the same batch. And so Past Tree Forest Fire by Hamid Roslan was also in consideration for this round of the prize. Did not win, but I understand it was very close between the two of them. And Hamid Roslan's book is also fascinating. It's this subversive, supposedly it's bilingual, so they have poems on one page on English, poems on the other page in Singlish, and you're like, are they translations of one another? That is questionable, but it looks at how language and power interrelate. And so whether this one or Gaze Back won in the Singapore Literature Prize, each would have been a groundbreaking win. And the last book on the list is We Make Spaces Divine by Pooja Nancy. So again, I was surprised to see this make it, not because it's not good. It's, when I read it earlier this year, I was very impressed, but because it's so new. It was published, I think, in January. And it's partly about how one reclaims spaces. So it's fitting that it carved itself a space on this list. So was there anyone you were surprised did not make the list?
Not really. I think that any list by definition will leave out people. So, it's kind of like inherent in the nature of list making that you're going to have to edit out people. But I think that this particular list, I think what surprised me was how comprehensive it was. Like you said, Pooja's book is so new, but it made it in. I think also because we all recognize that in the past 10 years, the scene has exploded so much, has become so much more diverse. And you can see that in the new entries in the list. This is reflective of like how diverse Singapore is. And I'm glad that the writing has finally caught up, that these books and these voices are getting published.
Yeah, it's a very exciting time for SingLit, and I think this list captures that excitement.
At the end of the day, we don't mean for the list to be definitive or exhaustive. Rather, we want it to serve as a starting point for readers who are new to SingLit, and we want it to spark conversations on what a local literary canon looks like. So it is not the be-all or end-all, it is a beginning. And that's what we have for you this episode. Once again, thank you for listening to us. I'm Olivia Ho.
And I'm Toh Wen Li.
And I'm Ong Sor Fern.
And you have been listening to our Bookmark This podcast, which you can subscribe to on your favorite smartphone audio apps, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Like us and rate us. We'll catch you next time.
That was an SPH podcast by the Straits Times. Find us on Spotify, Apple or Google Podcasts, or streaming on Google Home. Do feedback to us at podcast@sph.com.sg. You can also check out more podcasts on various topics at the Straits Times, the Business Times and Money FM 89.3.